So this is an article by Abigail Shrier. And she's a lady who wrote Irreversible Harm. I believe this is the name of the book. You know what? Once for all, I'm going to figure it out. Abigail Shrier. Irreversible Damage. Irreversible Damage is the name of her book. She wrote this book. It gets 4.7 out of 7,500 reviews. I really need to read that book. It sounds wonderful. Anyway, she wrote another uplifting article. None of this is uplifting. It's all very depressing. It's called Predator's Paradise. On the grounds creating a more welcoming environment for LGBTQ youth, State Senator Scott Wiener is making California a haven for human trafficking. Good. I'm so glad she wrote this because Scott Wiener has had my hackles up for quite some time now, and we're going to learn why in this article. It's very human interest driven, so it's very story bound. On a Saturday night in South Los Angeles, cars pull up and idle along the side streets of Figueroa, high beams ablaze, so that the drivers can get a good look at the girls. The women stand three astride in the middle of the street in pasties and G-string bikinis under fishnet dresses. Draped over their shoulders are unzipped coats. Even in temperate LA, the night's January chill is biting. In 7-inch lucite heels, they teeter toward the drivers of each car in the way you might walk barefoot across gravel. Less than a block away, their pimps keep company on a sidewalk corner in hoodies and loose jeans, watching their quarry awaiting the payout. Absent is the one thing that might typically break up the party, a police car. In early January, I joined Aaron Wilson and Stephanie Powell on a tour of The Track in Figueroa, one of California's busiest prostitution areas. For decades, Wilson, who volunteers for the anti-trafficking organization Journey Out, and her mother, Powell, have worked to combat human trafficking in Los Angeles and to help women and child victims escape this brutal world. Okay, so first of all, I don't have a lot of female role models. Abigail Shrier is certainly one of them. These ladies are too. Aaron Wilson and her mom. Where's her mom's name? Yeah, Stephanie Powell. So these ladies are all wonderful. We're going to meet another strong female role model too over the course of this article. In our post-feminist era, prostitution is so often idealized, sex work is work, that it's easy to overlook the gruesome reality of what it means to have a pimp and arrangement closer to slavery than any legitimate job. The horror stories I could tell you about prostitutes being beaten and being choked, being burned and gang raped, said Vanessa Russell of Love Never Fails, an anti-trafficking nonprofit based near Oakland. And the PTSD and all the mental health, trauma bonding, the psychotic breaks. Maybe you're somebody who likes to have sex more than once a day, but 9 to 21 times with different guys, some that are like 90 years old. Oh, goodness. 9 to 21 times over what period? I asked. 1 day, she said. That's healthy living? I don't think so. The body is not even made for that, like the pelvic inflammatory disease that you should see. She takes off the ways a woman's body is subjected to microbial assault. STDs, yeast infections, UTIs that are frequent among the women she sees. This is gritty. I'm sorry, guys. We're going to go through it because it's very important. Their hospital records prove, she says, that the human body is not meant to have that much activity going on. And then the girls that are out there where they're being sold, they don't even get to take showers in between. Oh my gosh, this is making my skin crawl. While the last few decades have seen an increase in human trafficking, women at all three of the anti-trafficking groups I spoke with across California agreed. Nothing compares with the stunning rise in trafficking they've witnessed in recent months. Powell, formerly a sergeant in the Los Angeles Police Department's Vice Division, knows the city's streets intimately. Over the last 6 months, the number of prostitutes has doubled, she says. On Figueroa, between 68th and 75th, in an hour, you might see about 30 girls out there. Now you'll see 60 to 65 girls in an hour. That's 1 a minute or more. What shifted? The answer, the anti-trafficking advocates told me, is Senate Bill 357. Signed by Governor Gavin Newsom in July, the measure decriminalized loitering with the intent to engage in prostitution. The bill did not officially take effect until January 1st of this year, but from the moment it became law back in July, these women say the on-the-ground reality changed. The minute the governor signed it, you started seeing an uptick on the streets, Powell said. And on social media, the pimps were saying, you better get out of there and work. You better get out there and work because the streets are ours. The pimps were right. Police stopped making arrests for crimes that would no longer be charged. Oh, great. The anti-loitering statute had provided the grounds for officers to question women and children whom they suspected might be trapped in a prostitution ring. As a police officer, you need probable cause to stop and investigate, Powell explained. So if I have a law that says you can't loiter in the area with pasties and a G-string, flagging down cars, I can stop you for that because you're loitering. But if I just say I'm stopping you because you look kind of young, that's a little weak. So it takes away a tool. Without the statute, police hands were suddenly tied. Henceforth, questioning the girls and potentially provoking a violent confrontation with pimps came to seem a Pyrrhic gamble, one that California's police officers would now avoid. Prostitution remains illegal in California, but police have lost significant ground in the effort to contain it. Women at anti-trafficking nonprofits in the Bay Area, San Diego, and Los Angeles all emphasize. The only time they have the right to engage and investigate is if they hear the transaction going on between the buyer and the exploited person, said Russell, who works closely with the Oakland Police Department. Which means it would have to be a sting operation where there's an undercover officer posing as an exploitive person who can actually hear the transaction. Any other scenarios would not be grounds for the police to get involved. Sergeant Marcos Campos of the Oakland Police Department told me that his force rescued 24 underage girls from the streets in 2021. But in 2022, that number dropped to 14, most from before the law was signed. Since, I believe, July, when we were officially told it passed, we've been directed by the District Attorney's Office to not arrest for Statute 653.22, which is loitering, he said. You might wonder at this point who actually benefits from Senate Bill 357. Sergeant Campos wonders too. Not the communities, he said, for whom the rise in trafficking brings more gun violence, which often attends prostitution. Not the sex workers, many of whom rely on police officers for help in escaping their pimps. I think if anything, it probably helped the sex trafficking the most, Campos said. Why would anyone propose such a law? Here we go. Why would the California state legislature pass it? I asked the bill's author, San Francisco-based state senator Scott Wiener. The answer he gave is one that he supplies for so many of the bill's authors. It was necessary to advance the rights of LGBTQ people. What? If you are standing on the sidewalk with high heels and you wear your hair a certain way and you wear tight clothing, an officer can say, I think you're loitering with the intention to commit prostitution and arrest you, Wiener said. That is not how we should be doing things in the United States of America, arresting people for how they look, he continued. And when you do that, not surprisingly, it's only certain kinds of people who actually get arrested. It's trans women. It's black women. It's an inherent profiling law, he said. Randomly arresting a bunch of black trans women for how they look is not protecting potential victims of human trafficking. Are you sure about that, Scott? Are you sure that in the entire history of prostitution in the entire state of California, there's never been a single black transgendered prostitute who was greatly helped out by the presence of California police officers? Because that is a very bold statement to make that I don't think you can back up. Let's continue. But were the police indeed randomly arresting a bunch of black trans women? The anti-trafficking advocates I spoke with dispute this. For starters, Wilson, Powell, and Russell, all of whom are African American, say that biological women and girls, not transgender individuals, constitute the vast majority of those trafficked. Of course, transgender people comprise a tiny fraction of the population. And even though they do live higher risk lifestyles than some, they still are probably not likely to be the majority of the people who are involved in human trafficking. Thank goodness for them. That's not a good thing. Nearly every report on human trafficking by global human rights organizations confirms this observation. And if the women I saw in Figueroa are any indication, discerning which are involved in prostitution does not require sophisticated sartorial judgments, but 2 eyes and a brain only. If a woman is wearing a G-string bikini in the middle of the street, and if she's flagging down cars while men in dark clothes stand watching as if holding an invisible leash, she is very likely to be a modern-day sex slave. Russell, who's worked in tech for 20 years, became interested in combating human trafficking while teaching inner-city kids to dance. 12 years ago, one of her students, age 15, was raped in Hayward and then trafficked throughout California for about a year. The girl had no mother or father in her life. She was being raised by family members, and someone did a strategy that's called Romeo pimping to get her to believe that they were her boyfriend. And then they introduced violence into the relationship, Russell said, and she ended up being sold by multiple exploiters throughout the Bay Area and Vallejo, Southern California, and Oakland, and so on. That's heartbreaking. Russell started Love Never Fails as part of the rescue mission for girls with like her former student. 12 years ago, people didn't even know what human trafficking was. There were all these myths about it being something that's only happening to people from other countries. There were myths about slavery has ended here. And so I think we did a good job of demonstrating that no, it's alive and well and it's happening here in the U.S. 83% of all cases within the U.S. are of U.S.-born people. On my ride along with Powell and Wilson in Los Angeles just after 10 p.m., before the track really gets going, I saw several lines of vehicles stretching around the block, each manned by a prospective client, waiting for his chance with one of the girls. At least 35 females worked the lines, most of them white or Latina. Many looked very young, under 18. I identified only one prostitute as transgender, though Powell noted that there were likely others at a second location on Western Avenue. Powell and Wilson told me that the traffic starts to pick up at 11 and peaks at midnight. As the hour neared 11, more and more women indeed appeared along Figueroa, but Powell and Wilson made certain that we left before midnight. After 11:30, the chance of gun violence erupting around the pimps escalates. We would not be safe. In Oakland and in the San Diego area, Russell and Marissa Ugarte, a woman who runs an anti-trafficking group out of San Diego County, reiterated that the vast majority of the trafficked are female African-American women and girls in Oakland. Russell was careful to specify, but there's another population Russell had seen rise in the last years in the ranks of victims, those that identify as LGBTQIA+. Good job, Scott Wiener. Scott Wiener's social media antics might invite comparisons with those of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar. On Twitter, he's posted pictures of himself posing bare-chested at San Francisco's Folsom Street Fair, arms slung around men in bondage gear. During the monkeypox outbreak last summer, he approvingly tweeted an article encouraging gay men to cover up their bumps with Band-Aids and party on. And he threatened to make Drag Queen 101 a mandatory part of K-12 education. He later said the threat was tongue-in-cheek. Like other media-adroit, attention-seeking politicians, Wiener seems to delight in trolling his detractors. Sure, fine, plenty of room for trolling. Yet in a political era defined by legislative gridlock in Washington, Wiener stands out as one of the nation's most effective lawmakers. In the 6 years since the Harvard Law grad, of course he's a Harvard Law grad, of course he is, of freaking course he is, took office, he's managed to author and get passed a series of radical gender and sex-related bills. The measures have allowed biological male felons to self-ID their way into women's prisons, assigned criminal penalties to healthcare workers who fail to provide gender-affirming care, made California a sanctuary state for LGBTQ youth, expanded access to gender-affirming care for LGBTQ-identified youth with and without parental approval, proposed jail time for healthcare workers who willfully and repeatedly misgender a patient, i.e. refer to them in a way at odds with their gender identity, decriminalized the intentional exposure of a sexual partner to HIV, and reduced criminal penalties for sex offenders, particularly sex offenders who take advantage of young boys, very tellingly. So most people will probably know him for his antics with the HIV bill. He decriminalized it. It is no longer a crime in California to intentionally or unintentionally infect someone with HIV. I think it is knowingly. I think that's the understanding. Yeah, decriminalize the intentionally exposure of a sexual partner to HIV. Another Wiener bill, introduced in 2021, sought to decriminalize psilocybin and ketamine, but it failed to pass, partly because of the vocal opposition of former state Senate Republican Melissa Melendez. And before you tell me that the war on drugs is bad, listen to why she opposed it and listen to why it's likely that Scott Wiener wanted it. Melissa Melendez, who railed against easing restrictions on ketamine, a drug notorious for facilitating date rape. I'm like, do you guys not see the agenda here? I mean, honestly, in the legislature, I think people came to just sort of accept those types of bills from him because he's from San Francisco, she told me in a telephone conversation. Undeterred, Wiener in December reintroduced a modified version of the bill. Very nice of him to want to decriminalize the drug that makes date rape more possible after he decriminalized intentionally infecting with people with HIV and also decriminalized disgusting sexual acts between men and underage boys. As both a former Senate aide and a California Republican Party strategist told me, Wiener, one of the country's most prominent and outspoken defenders of LGBTQ rights, is uniquely difficult to oppose, and I bet you guys all know why. The moment you speak out against one of his bills, just like he does with me, he turns around and says, "You're homophobic or transphobic. You're this or you're that," Melendez says. "I don't care. You can call me whatever name you want. That doesn't change the fact what your bill does." This is why I think that she's actually pretty heroic, especially for somebody from California. Wiener indeed typically argues that his politically charged gender and sex-related bills are needed to fight individual discrimination against LGBTQ people. When Greg Abbott announced the state of Texas was going to investigate and prosecute parents who had allowed their trans kids to get gender-affirming care, we knew we needed to do something, he said. And when we saw it started to spread to other states and we sprang into action and put it together, the Sanctuary State Bill, to make clear that if kids did not feel safe in Texas or other states, they could come to California and we would do our best to protect them. This has the vibes of Dylan Mulvaney's friend, Jeffrey Marsh, talking about how if your family doesn't accept you, I will. I'll be your friend. It doesn't matter if you're underage. If you're confused and you need help, if you're questioning your gender or sexuality, you can come to me. You can come to us. You don't need those slimy parents. They don't understand you. And does that not sound exactly like a predator? To me, what Scott Wiener is trying to do is to turn California into literally a sanctuary for predators, which is basically the title of this article. So, holy cow, yeah, it's really hard to deny. But if some of Wiener's bills seek to protect LGBTQ youth, it also represents a golden opportunity for a different group, adults who would take advantage of them. Wiener is, quote, "an extremely dangerous person, so extremely dangerous that I cannot believe that people cannot read between the lines," said Marisa Ugarte, who runs an anti-trafficking nonprofit Bilateral Safety Corridor Coalition based in National City just south of San Diego. Wiener is turning California, she warned, into a sex trafficking paradise. Yeah, and I don't think it's an accident. I don't think that this man is operating in good faith. And I think that everybody needs to know about this because this is absolutely incredible. I'm so glad Abigail Shrier decided to write about it. Whatever the intent behind many of his bills, this does seem to be their effect, to make life better for sexual predators, which tells me that it's possible Scott Wiener has a few skeletons in his own closet, which is no doubt full of disgusting bondage gear. Consider the Wiener-authored Senate Bill 145, a 2020 measure that amended the sex offender registration laws in California so that an adult having anal or oral sex with a minor could avoid getting placed on the sex offender registry, as long as the child was at least 14 and the adult was no more than a decade older. This is what I'm talking about. This is not in good faith. Not only is it disgusting, it's so clearly bad faith and so clearly rooted in actual evil as to be distinctly unsettling. Everyone should be paying attention to this because Andrew Klavan always used to say, and I'm sure other people have said it before, California is just the rest of the U.S. in 5 years. So I wouldn't be surprised if Scott Wiener wins the presidency in the next few rounds. Defenders of the law have noted that there has long been judicial latitude in California in whether to place perpetrators of statutory rape on the sex offender registry if the crime involved was vaginal or intercourse with the minor was at least 14, and the offender was within 10 years of her age. So this is similar to Romeo and Juliet laws, although this is certainly the loosest that I've ever seen. Wiener's bill extends such potential leniency in sentencing to statutory rape involving anal or oral sex. He has many times defended the bill as required to end, quote, blatant discrimination against LGBT young people regarding California's sex offender registry, as his website declares. Sneaky, sneaky, slimy snake. The only thing Senate Bill 145 did was treat LGBTQ young people exactly the same way that straight young people have always been treated on the sex offender registry, which is if you're within a certain age range, there's a statutory rape that happened, then judges have always had the discretion to decide whether someone should go on the sex offender registry. he told me. Wiener is correct on the history. California law did treat 25-year-old statutory rapists differently depending on the manner of intercourse that they had with their victims. That discrepancy called out for remediation. The same treatment should apply to anal sex with a minor. Sorry, guys, this is super gritty. You know what? It's pretty long, too, so I'm actually going to scroll down a little bit to see what Abigail's conclusion is. If you guys haven't read this article, I firmly recommend it. She is a great author, and she is displaying some really disgusting stuff. Wiener's detractors often assign him malign intentions, but guessing at intent is unproductive. The truth is, his intent doesn't really matter. The effects of naivety, ambition, or wrong-headed zeal for social transformation can be just as devastating as anything proceeding from darker motives. I think that's fair. I mean, he's a smart guy, a Republican former Senate staffer said. On other issues, those that aren't hot-buttonish social issues, he likes to hear opposing opinions and likes to try and address concerns that people have. He's even earned the reputation in San Francisco of being a moderate, supportive of real estate developers who have donated handsomely to his campaigns, for instance, and opposing far leftists on the environment. Wiener is often statesmanlike and easy to get along with, the GOP staffer told me, and he would present a formidable campaign to replace Nancy Pelosi in the 11th district as her congressional career draws to a close. That's great. That's really exciting. But in terms of legislative influence, that would almost certainly be a step down. From his perch in America's most left-leaning district, Wiener is already legislating for the country, establishing a model for ambitious, progressive office holders to follow, and inviting America's misunderstood children to flock to the Golden State. The sex industry has historically capitalized on people who feel lost, people who feel unloved, people who feel unseen, Russell observed. And, they do a great job, especially when they're in the throes of it, of making that person believe that they're having a good time. And later, when they're more stabilized, they'll come back and go, oh my gosh, that was so horrible. It was one of the worst times of my life. Abigail Shrier is a writer living in Los Angeles and author of Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. She's an excellent author and certainly a role model. It is a longer article than I realized, so my apologies on that front. And it certainly is gritty, but these are the realities that we have in our world right now. It's something that conservatives desperately need to come to grips with, because it's not always nice. It's certainly not always pretty, and it's very, very hard to have these real conversations without a firm grasp of what's really going on.